Bainbridge here, and welcome back to INC Live and for our first post-fight recap of 2022. And it's a big one in more than one sense. The heavyweight title is on the line. It's power versus finesse. It's brunt versus brain. It's Francis Ngannou versus Ciryl Gane. Let's get to the fights. First off, I want to say a big thank you to everybody who's been supporting this channel over the past year. It's grown far bigger than I ever expected it to, bearing in mind most of the videos are just me talking to a camera. So thank you very much for that. If you would like to continue to support us, then please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell so you never miss any of our content. We hope to do more post-fight recaps, the preview show with John. We'll hopefully get a few more fighter interviews. Any sort of support that you can give us, post a comment if you want, will be greatly appreciated. With all the hot dogging and grandstanding out the way though, let's talk about our main event. Francis Ngannou beating Ciryl Gane, but to the surprise of many, doing so by unanimous decision and doing so with a very wrestling heavy performance. Now a lot of people, I include myself in this, were framing this fight basically as Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder. You had Francis Ngannou, big power puncher. If he connects with you once, you're going to go down in the first two rounds. Versus Ciryl Gane, light on his feet, very evasive, throws a fantastic array of teep kicks, jabs, who, if he survives some of Francis's early onslaught, was going to dominate come the final 3 rounds. The great thing about this sport is you can never, ever predict. And we saw this again, and a great credit to Francis Ngannou for adjusting his game plan to the situation in front of him and ending up winning this fight. First 2 rounds, I felt played out the way that I think a lot of fans expected it to. We saw Ciryl Gane light on his feet, and he was targeting Francis's body a lot there. And you could see that Francis, I've always been maybe a little bit unsure about Francis's conditioning, especially after what we saw against Stipe, and I know that was a few years ago, so you can't really read too much into that, but it's always been a concern, and I did think Francis was maybe breathing a bit heavy. And for me, Ciryl was winning that fight 2-0 going into the third. When Francis landed that massive pro wrestling style power slap, and you can actually see there's a picture doing the rounds on the internet of Francis during the middle of that slap, and the faces on the crowd, just this look of absolute shock at seeing this perennial striker suddenly going for takedowns and holding down his opponent. And I reacted the same way. I did not expect Francis to go this wrestling heavy. Now the clues were maybe there in hindsight. I mean, he trains at Extreme Couture. If you've trained somewhere called Couture, you're going to be expected to have some kind of wrestling base. But to see him leaning on it in the way that he did, it was almost like Kamaru Usman. I know there's this joke going around, heavyweight Usman is sort of running around with circles with a lot of people who try and jump on that sort of meme culture. Very impressive for Francis. In terms of what Ciryl did, I think Ciryl fought his fight, and for those first 2 rounds, I don't think there was any real sort of issue. Yes, you can maybe say he should have maybe been a bit better off his back, but when you've got a 265-pound man holding you down, it's going to be hard for anybody to deal with that. A lot of people are going to point when it comes to Ciryl in regards to the leg lock at the end of the 3rd round. I personally don't think Ciryl realised how close he was to winning this fight. That felt very Hail Mary. That felt like, okay, I'm losing this fight. I need to do something to try and finish. And that's why he went for the leg lock. And Ciryl is a good leg lock guy. We saw that when he fought Dontel Mays, that he's able to submit people quite late on in a match. But I think if he knew it was 2 rounds apiece, he would have stayed in top position from that takedown and held it there. And what I did find quite interesting though, and I was quite sad to see this, was the crowd seemed very negative towards Ciryl Gane. I know that Francis is the big power puncher, and I know that he gets the big dramatic knockouts, but Ciryl Gane wasn't doing anything fundamentally bad. He wasn't boring people off. This wasn't John Fitch. This wasn't Elias Theodorou. This was a guy fighting a very technical fight. And maybe it's because it's a heavyweight matchup and people want to see the big fat guy brawlers knocking each other out. I was disappointed to see that. In terms of what I wanted from, I think Francis, as much as I do like Ciryl, Francis fits the image of the UFC heavyweight champion in terms of how he fights. So I think maybe from that context, it was maybe better for him to win. But I'm not going to let last night's performance deter my opinion of Ciryl Gane. This is an incredibly talented guy. 10 fights into his career, he's already fighting for a belt. Only started training in 2018. That is incredibly impressive. And if he continues the way he does, he learns from this mistake, he maybe knows how to deal with the takedown threat, he's going to be a champion. Because he is incredibly talented. What he is basically is heavyweight Shevchenko. Very technical. You appreciate the skill that goes into his fighting style, but it maybe doesn't have the flashiness, which maybe does put people off. And Shevchenko obviously has the marketability factor, attractive girl, so she can maybe get away with fighting a less than aggressive style. This is where things get interesting though. Francis Ngannou is the heavyweight champion, and his contract is coming up at the end of the year. And based on what he was saying, he's got an ACL injury and an MCL, so there's the possibility that that was Francis Ngannou's last fight on this contract. We know what Dana White's like. Dana White can be incredibly petulant, and we've seen him deal with a lot of noteworthy fighters in bad ways. Dana is not going to want his heavyweight champion taking his belt with him over into the boxing ring, where potentially he could be facing, I don't know, like an Andy Ruiz, for example. And Andy Ruiz putting on a clinic and beating his heavyweight champion. It's not going to be a good look for the UFC. And if the UFC choose to create a new champion, whoever that is, whether it is Gane, Stipe, John Jones, etc., they are not going to be seen with that level of legitimacy because they never beat the champion to do it. I think Dana as well has really underestimated the public's feeling towards Francis. Because more often than not, Dana has a lot of leverage in regards to these contract disputes. Because he has the fans on his side and he's dealing with people who maybe aren't at the top of their game. Guys who are getting older, guys who are coming off a loss. And because there's a lot of fans out there who believe that the UFC is the be-all and end-all of MMA, they normally take his side and say, well, I don't really agree with that, but I can understand. This time around though, I think people are really sympathizing with Francis a lot more than what Dana expected. And because he's still got the belt and he's still got that winning streak, it's going to be very hard to try and win over the public and say that Francis Ngannou leaving the UFC is good for the company. It's not. Francis Ngannou is the baddest man on the planet. He's the heavyweight champion of the world. He warrants a pay rise and Dana isn't willing to give him one. These next 12 months are going to be incredibly fascinating, even more so, dare I say, than last night's fight. In terms of the rest of the card, we need to focus on that co-main event, and we have a new, or should that be old, UFC Flyweight champion Deivison Figueiredo regains the belt, beating Brandon Moreno by unanimous decision, 48-47 on all of the judges' scorecards. A very close fight, in some cases, I know a lot of people are arguing this one, saying it's controversial and that Brandon Moreno was robbed. This was just a close fight. I personally thought that Brandon Moreno had won this one, but I understand why people did pick Figueiredo to win this one. Now, I was very critical of Figueiredo for his performance at 263. And that wasn't a Figueiredo who was 100%. And I did say on the preview show, even though I did pick Moreno to win this one, Figueiredo, on his day, if he gets every aspect of the preparations for this fight right, he can more than easily win this one. And that's what we saw. Like, the moment I saw Deivison Figueiredo step on the scales, looking far, far healthier than he did at UFC 263, I started to second guess my prediction. Because I thought, he's got that part of the game right. If he can cover other elements of it to handle the boxing of Brandon Moreno, then I thought he's going to have himself a big shot. And he did just that. I think when you're fighting someone with a big boxing heavy style in the way that Brandon does, you need to target the legs. So credit to Henry Cejudo and his team for covering that base. And you saw that Brandon Moreno, I think even after he had his post-fight interview, you could see him walking out the cage. He is limping very, very badly. So it shows that those leg kicks were working, and because he did that, he disrupted the movement of Brandon, which, if you remember the second fight, was a big factor in why Brandon ended up winning. Deivison just could not get a read on the guy because he was moving so much, but by neutralizing the movement, he was able to crack him a lot more. With that being said though, if you look at the stat numbers, Brandon Moreno landed a hell of a lot more strikes than what Figueiredo did. But Figueiredo was having the moment. He dropped him at the end of the 3rd round. He dropped him in the middle of the 5th round. And sometimes when you have a close fight like that, those little moments are what stay in the judges' minds. It reminds me a little bit of Piotr Jan versus Jimmy Rivera. With that being said though, I don't see Figueiredo holding it for a long time. Because so much of Figueiredo's game relies on getting to fight night absolutely 100%. If he can do that, like we saw last night, like we saw when he fought Alex Perez, he's unstoppable. Even though I picked Brandon Moreno to win this one, and I personally thought that Brandon did enough to win this one, I don't want to see it run back. Because Flyweight is in a very good place right now, and it has a lot of strong contenders who, in my opinion, deserve an opportunity to get that belt. So give the next shot to Pantoja, or Askar Askarov, or Kai Kara-France, someone of that sort of ilk. Because as much as I have enjoyed the trilogy between these two, and they have been great entertaining fights, Figueiredo versus Moreno 3, one fight on the night last night, I don't want to see it run back again just because it's going to stagnate things. Let's get some fresh blood in. Let's try and get new contenders. And if Moreno does enough in these next couple of fights to warrant a rematch, then I'll be down for it. Other great performances that I need to point out in terms of the rest of the card, going to the prelims for this one. And anybody knows that Uncle Joey, Clay from Uncle Joey, is a big contributor to this channel. He called out Victor Henry. He told me, oh, I've seen this guy in Ryzen. He's wacky, but he's very, very good. And he showed that again. What he did to Heoni Barcelos, who I saw a lot of people backing this guy as potentially a star in the making. I mean, one of those great sort of unranked bantamweight fighters who will always liven up a fight night. And Victor Henry comes in, short notice fight, you got to remember this, and he puts on a clinic on this guy. It was a very impressive performance, and at 34 years old, I don't know whether or not he's going to be like make a long-term impact on the UFC, but he deserves to be on a lot more people's radar after that performance, because it was very good showing from him. Michael Morales, what a good war he had with Trevin Giles, really good fight there. On a similar note, Mafiovola, he took on Genaro Valdez, unbeaten guy. Whether or not Valdez was maybe worthy of being in the UFC, there's some question marks about that. But you got to remember, the last time we saw Mafiovola, he got knocked out in 7 seconds by Terence McKinney, and yet waded himself into that fire once again and managed to get himself a first round stoppage. So all the credit to him for that one. Saeed Nurmagomedov, first round submission over Cody Stamann in the first minute, I should say. That's a big blow for Cody. And I do like Cody Stamann, and I know that his grappling is up there with some of the very best in this weight class. But we're looking at a guy now who's, won in his past 5? And now the questions are going to start. And it's unfortunately, a lot of MMA is a results business. And if you're not getting the results, there start to be some questions. You just can't rely on a lot of people saying, no, this guy is actually very good. You've got to back it up at times. And Stamann's in a sort of do or die situation, which is quite uncomfortable to see. That's our recap though of UFC 270. I want to say a big thank you once again to everybody who's been tuning in and who has been continuing to support our channel. Please also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/INCagefighting. And if you like us enough to donate any kind of monetary funds, everything goes into this channel. I have to stress that. It is patreon.com/itsnotcagefighting. We're going to take a week's break. Obviously, there's no UFC fight card, which is happening next week. And when we'll be back, it'll be in 2 weeks' time when me and John will be talking about UFC 271. Israel Adesanya versus Robert Whittaker, the rematch that Oceania has been waiting for several years. This is the INC. Thank you very much for joining us.